Hi, boys and girls. I hope you've had a good week at home. I've been thinking a lot about family, as I've mentioned, over the course of the week. Today, I'm thinking about family that is not just the family that we might live with in our houses. Some of us have the lucky opportunity to live with our grandparents and maybe aunts and uncles and cousins. Others of us have family members that are very far away. The story that I want to share with you today is about family also. And it's a story about family that reaches way, way back and talks about different things that families create as traditions. Sometimes traditions, which are things that people do over and over and over again to let them feel connected. Sometimes those traditions include something called a keepsake. A keepsake is something that you can hang on to and keep and carry through those generations of time. Generations are groups of families or people on earth over many, many years of time. This is a story called The Keeping Quilt. Quilt is a special blanket, and you may have heard that word when we study the letter Q, because it starts with Q, and the sound is qua at the beginning of quilt. So you might have heard that word and you might already know what it means, but in this story it gives you a way better piece of information about what a quilt is, and it also helps you to understand how families keep traditions over time and over years. The illustrations in this book are done in a super interesting way where it is mostly pencil, which is not a lot of color, and then a little splash of color that comes in as well. So you'll be looking for that as you go through. The author and illustrator is Patricia Polacco. Again, I'm just sticking with her this week. And the story is an autobiographical story. Autobiography means a story about the person who's writing it. So Patricia Polacco wrote this story. It's also about her and her family and their story in coming to America and spending their generations of time here. When my great-grandmother Anna came to America, she wore the same thick overcoat and big boots she had worn for farm work. But her family weren't dirt farmers anymore. In New York City, her father's work was hauling things on a wagon, and the rest of the family made artificial flowers all day. Artificial means fake, so they made silk and plastic flowers. Everyone was in a hurry, and it was so crowded, not like in back home Russia, but all the same, it was their home, and most of their neighbors were just like them. When Anna went to school, English sounded to her like pebbles dropping into shallow water. Shh, shh, shh. In 6 months, she was speaking English. I'm going to stop there for a second and say that we have a lot of kids in our class who had the exact same experience Anna did. When many of us started kindergarten, we didn't know how to speak English. We had not heard a lot of English, and yet you guys are so amazing and your brains are so miraculous that all of you are doing the same thing, learning what English words mean when you hear them and learning how to speak them as well. And every time I watch that happen, it just amazes me what you're able to do in your lives when you know 2 languages. Her parents almost never learned English, so she also spoke to them. The only things she had left of back home Russia were her dress and the babushka she liked to throw up into the air when she was dancing. So that babushka is the red scarf that she's using. You might remember that word babushka from the Trees of the Dancing Goats that we read earlier this week, because in Russian, babushka not only means grandmother, but it also is the word for this scarf that she's dancing with. So it has 2 meanings. We know lots of words in English that have 2 meanings as well. That's one of the words in Russian that has 2 meanings. And her dress was getting too small. After her mother had sewn her a new one, she took her old dress and babushka, and then from a basket of old clothes, she took Uncle Vladimir's shirt, Aunt Havela's nightdress, and an apron of Aunt Natasha's. "We will make a quilt to help us always remember home," Anna's mother said. "It will be like having the family in back home Russia dance around us at night." And so it was. Anna's mother invited all the neighborhood ladies. They cut out animals and flowers from the scraps of clothing. Anna kept the needles threaded and handed them to the ladies as they needed them. The border of the quilt was made of Anna's babushka. So the border is the outside of that beautiful quilt that they're making to keep for generations. If you notice the print and the color, it's the same as the babushka that Anna was dancing around with, because they used that material and cut it into the shape of the border and then sewed it on. On Friday nights, Anna's mother would say the prayers that started the Sabbath. The family ate challah and chicken soup. The quilt was the tablecloth. Do you see the quilt there? So now it's not being wrapped around people as a blanket, but used as a tablecloth. Anna grew up and fell in love with great-grandpa Sasha. To show he wanted to be her husband, he gave Anna a gold coin, a dried flower, and a piece of rock salt, all tied into a linen handkerchief. Do you know what a handkerchief is? It's a little square of fabric that people in the old days especially, sometimes people do it now, but not nearly as much as they did back in the old days, like when this story was taking place. It's a little piece of cloth or fabric that they actually used to wipe their noses if they had a runny nose, or to wipe their foreheads if they were sweaty. And then they just balled it up and kept it in their pockets. And then when they got home, they would run it through the washer and wash and dry it and use it again the next day. So as a gift, lots of times those handkerchiefs were decorated really beautifully with lots of embroidered or stitched little flowers and other things on them. So they would be a beautiful gift to give to someone. So Grandpa Sasha gave it to Anna, and the gold was for wealth, the flower was for love, and the salt so their lives would have flavor. She accepted the hanky, which is a different word, a shorter word, an abbreviation, which is a shorter word for a handkerchief. And they were engaged, which means they promised each other to be married. Under the wedding huppah, Anna and Sasha promised each other love and understanding. After the wedding, the men and the women celebrated separately. So again, in the older days and in this culture, after they were married, the men danced together and the women danced together, and they didn't dance all as one group. They danced separately. When my grandma Carla was born, Anna wrapped her daughter in the quilt to welcome her warmly into the world. Carla was given a gift of gold, flour, salt, and bread. Gold so she would never know poverty. Poverty is a big word which just means poor, not having very much money. A flour so she would always know love. Salt so her life would always have flavor. And bread so she would never know hunger. She would never know what it was like to be hungry. She would always have enough food. Carla learned to keep the Sabbath and to cook and to clean and to do washing. Married you'll be someday, Anna told Carla. So there is that quilt again. This time welcoming a baby. Then it's been washed and hung out to dry. And again the quilt became a wedding huppah, this time for Carla's wedding to Grandpa George. Men and women celebrated together, but they still didn't dance together. So this time they were able to be at the party together, but they still didn't dance together. The men danced separately and the women danced separately, which is just an interesting thing that was happening in this culture at that time. In Carla's wedding bouquet was a gold coin, bread, and salt. Carla and George moved to a farm in Michigan, and great-grandma Anna came to live with them. The quilt once again wrapped a new little girl, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen called Anna Lady Grandma. She'd grown very old and was sick a lot of time. The quilt kept her legs warm. On Anna's 98th birthday, the cake was a kulich, a rich cake with raisins and candied fruit in it. So in this picture, you can see the quilt keeping Grandma Anna warm. In this picture, you can see it being used as a tablecloth for a special occasion. When great-grandma Anna died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. My mother, Mary Ellen, was now a grown-up. So there, the quilt is keeping Grandma Anna warm, even when she's very, very old and sick. When Mary Ellen left home, she took the quilt with her. When she became a bride, which means when she got married, the quilt became her huppah. For the first time, friends who were not Jews came to the wedding. My mother wore a suit, but in her bouquet were gold, bread, and salt. I love this picture. It's a picture of when she grew up. The quilt went with her, as I just read, but look at that little splash of color inside of her car when she leaves home. And there she is at her wedding. The quilt welcomed me, Patricia Polacco, into the world. And it was the tablecloth for my first birthday party. So again, here it is, wrapping the author of the story, Patricia Polacco, in a blanket when she's a tiny baby who has just been born. And then here it is as the tablecloth when she turns 1. At night, I would trace my fingers around the edge of each animal on the quilt before I went to sleep. I told my mother stories about the animals on the quilt. She told me whose sleeve had made the horse, whose apron had made the chicken, whose dress had made the flowers, and whose babushka went around the edge of the quilt as its border. The quilt was a pretend cape when I was in the bull ring, or sometimes a tent in the steaming Amazon jungle. So here she is with her mother telling the stories of all of the tiny pieces of fabric that went together to make the quilt. And here she is using it as a cape and also as a tent. So she's not really using it as a cape, and she's not really in the Amazon jungle. The Amazon jungle's on the other side of the world. She's pretending and she's imagining it as the two of those things. At my wedding to Enzo Mario, men and women danced together. In my bouquet were gold, bread, and salt, and a sprinkle of wine, so I would always know laughter. There it is again. 20 years ago, I held Tracy Denise in the quilt for the first time. Someday, she too will leave home, and she will take the quilt with her, just as all of the generations before Patricia Polacco had done in her family. And that's the end of the story. I'm going to turn to one of the last pages because it just gives an idea of something that you might want to do while you're at home. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I used to love to build forts inside my house. And in one of these pictures, that's exactly what Patricia Polacco did when she was a little girl. So it talked about her building a tent on the Amazon. But what you can do is you can use any blanket you can find in your house and make a little tent like that. You can drape it over the couch. You can drape it over a table. You can do anything you want with a blanket, and it becomes a little fort for you. And inside that fort, you can tell yourself stories. You can imagine stories that you make up on your own. You can bring your stuffed animals in there and tell them stories. So making a quilt making a tent is a super fun and cool thing you can do right now. So enjoy your time with your family, and I will see you again soon.